All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Hildebrand Summer Seminar and to the first of what look like two very good afternoon sessions today. Our first session here is going to focus on the theme of educating the whole person and thinking about what personalism can say about educating persons, and especially about the importance of aesthetic education in the place of beauty in education. We have two fine speakers on this panel. Our first speaker is Margarita Mooney. She is an associate professor in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, and she's previously taught at Yale and the University of North Carolina. And second, we have Christopher Haley, who has already been introduced to you. He's Director of Publications and Marketing for the Hildebrand Project, and he was educated at St. Edward's University, the University of Texas, and the University of Dallas. And he is one of the finest appreciators of music and poetry that I know. So I'm sure he will say many interesting things about aesthetic education today. Just a reminder, as we go along here, please put your questions into the question and answer box, and I will select from them after we hear from our speakers. So Margarita, go ahead.
Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be speaking at this seminar. It is the first time I have been a speaker, and I'm honored to be here. Before I jump into this question of education and aesthetics, thought I would just introduce how I initially encountered personalism and show you how my initial encounter with personalism has become incorporated into the work I'm currently doing on education and human formation, both through my teaching in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, and also through Scala Foundation, a nonprofit I started whose mission is to revitalize culture by restoring meaning and purpose to education. The first personalist thinker I ever encountered was Jacques Maritain. And I encountered him because of my own background, having lived and worked in Latin America, and I was really interested in his work on the person and the common good. And without going into a lot of details on Jacques Maritain's integral humanism, which I teach in my seminars, it was really his ability and his combination of a scholastic approach to theology and philosophy of defining concepts clearly, along with a keen attention to phenomenology and to human experience at its most profound level, that caught my attention. Because at the time I was training in sociology for my PhD, and I cared a lot about both of those things. The concepts that we use to analyze the world we live in, as well as the depths of human experience, which can be mysterious, but yet so important to our understanding of our human nature as a unity of mind, body, and soul. It was only much later in my career, when I was done with my PhD and had been teaching at several universities for about 10 years, that I read Jacques Maritain's book, Education at a Crossroads, which I cite in one of the articles that I submitted for this seminar. And what caught me there was that Maritain was calling our attention back to education in its broadest sense, as certainly including the transmission of knowledge and content, but also anything adults do to instruct the young. And what Maritain is doing in that book, Education at a Crossroads, is still incredibly relevant today, because in that book, he's engaging actually in a debate with the philosopher John Dewey, who was enormously influential in the spread of public education and had a philosophy underlying his view of education, which, in my view, echoing Maritain, neglects the spiritual pre-conscious of the person and leads to an overly socialized understanding of the person, where the mysterious element, the place of encounter with the sacred, becomes completely conflated with doing. So the larger issue I want to point, that I think that Maritain and the personalists have helped me see, is that modern philosophy and modern society has lost the language of being. And we've transformed everything about our being into doing. And this, I think, is a fundamental problem with Dewey. So without going into all of those details, what I hope you'll remember today from what I'm about to say is that we need to recover the idea of education as formation. It's formation in virtue, where our interior dispositions and our practical actions are aligned, pointing towards our telos, the good. And I think that this is enormously important today because of some of the trends that I see in education, where our deeply contemplative nature as human beings, our attentiveness and excitement about reality has become, in some ways, anesthetized and turned into nothing more than a practical tool. For so many people, the end of education is to give people a set of practical tools. And what I want to recover is the idea that education is about human formation. Education is contemplative and it's practical. And the reason I draw on Maritain so heavily is I think he lays this framework out beautifully, that education is contemplative and it's practical. Let me now say a few things which may be harder to follow if you've not encountered these ideas before, but they're alluded to in the articles that I submitted for today about the Benedictine charism and poetic knowledge. And I want to explain a little bit more of those concepts and then ultimately argue for why we need to recover a sense of the aesthetic in education and what are some practical ways to do that. So I went from reading Maritain's Person in the Common Good and Integral Humanism to reading his work on education and education at a crossroads. And more recently, just in the last couple of years, it was through a recommendation from the poet Dana Gioia that I read Maritain's Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. And from that, I argued in the piece that I wrote that you read, hopefully, that Maritain has, I think, explains for us very well something that he calls poetic knowledge and argues for why we need to recover a sense of the poetic knowledge. Well, what is this poetic knowledge? He doesn't mean necessarily writing poems, but what Maritain does in this book, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, which he makes this claim that human beings have a spiritual preconscious from which all other capacities emanate. Why is that so important? Again, because I think in so much of modern philosophy, and certainly in the social sciences that I studied, there's a conflation between the spiritual preconscious and our psychology, our emotions, our cognition, our thinking about things. All of those things are important. Our emotions are important. How we solve problems is important. But human beings aren't first and foremost problem solvers. We're beings with a spiritual preconscious, which is the life-giving spirit that then works its way through our emotions and the objects that we create in the world. But what has happened, I think, in so much of the language of modern psychology is we're seen as creatures of drives, right? There's a piece that I assign in many of my classes by Max Shaler, a phenomenologist, where he argues that there's been a fundamental shift. He provides, I think, really helpful devices to understand the fundamental shift in the understanding of the human person. Whereas for someone like Maritain, we are beings, we're created, and our ultimate freedom is in knowing and obeying the will of God. But in modern times, what we've become is what Shaler calls homo faber. We're primarily creatures of drives to make things. Yeah, sure, we have passions and we have instincts, but those passions and instincts are intended to serve what, for homo faber, are our fundamental needs of survival, power, hunger. And so Maritain is calling us back to this idea of the human person as having a spiritual preconscious, a place where we are a unity of mind, body, and soul. And so for Maritain, experiences of beauty are a primary way that we form, that we educate our spiritual preconscious. Because he says that the objects we make and the actions we take emanate from our spiritual preconscious, but then act back upon it in a way that forms our identity and our subjectivity into beings who have inner qualities of stability and know how to use our capacities for the good. Why is this so important? To me, this is so important because so much of our education today, I think, fragments people's identity and fragments their desires without any direction to them. And so not seeing that we need to form this spiritual preconscious, to give it a direction, to integrate it into something higher, has led to, I think, a fragmentation that is part of why we see astonishing rates of depression amongst college students. And it's been rising dramatically in the last 10 years. It's part of the reason that I started studying educational philosophy and started Scala, was because I was looking for how to respond to these astounding rates of mental illness amongst college students. And part of what they were telling me, I went looking for the philosophy to kind of explain in conceptual language what students were telling me, that their education was fragmenting them. And it was leaving them with a sense that they're nothing but creatures of action, not contemplative creatures who have a higher purpose, who, yes, care about the practical things, but who also see as a fundamental need to form this spiritual conscience and seek the truth. And for so many young people, they're essentially told one version or another that take the tools of education and go create anything you want out of it. Human nature is no longer a limitation to what we can do, right? Students are told this, that we can surpass, we can overcome these limitations put on us by our human nature. And what I saw again and again was that although this kind of seems like liberation, it's liberation only in a sense of overcoming a contradiction, freeing oneself from constraints. It's a liberation as autonomy from constraint. It's not a liberation of directing our drives and our desires towards a higher good. And it robs students, I think, of the joy of seeing their talents being used to pursue something that's considered in and of itself right and true and good and, dare I say, beautiful, right? The right way of living. So I get so excited about these ideas around the creative intuition and the spiritual preconscious because guess what? Education is supposed to feel fulfilling. Yes, it's supposed to be useful, but it's also supposed to bring us back to experiences of contemplation and joy. And so nothing pleases me more as a teacher than to see my students using their creativity and not only learning the subjects that I care about, but learning in joy. And so the title of the book that I just published, The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts, I intentionally picked that term, the love of learning, because we are meant to know the truth, but we're also meant to love the truth. And today, scientific rationalism, the idea that the only kind of truth that we can have comes from methods of empirical observation, this has taken over what we understand by truth, right? Truth has been reduced to a kind of empiricist rationalism in so many segments of education. And in that framework, beauty is at most an emotional experience, but not a fundamental human experience that opens up our hearts and directs us towards the good. So I think we need to recover a proper understanding of beauty, for which I have, of course, turned to other personalists like Dietrich von Hildebrand. His work on aesthetics is fantastic. And his work on aesthetics makes the point very clearly that beauty isn't elitist, it is for everybody. There may be standards of excellence in beauty as there are standards of excellence in writing, but beauty is for everybody because it's fundamental to who we are. And so that's why I use Maritanne's work on creative intuition and poetic knowledge to argue that poetic knowledge is actually a basis of an ethical position towards other people. because it helps us to see others as also, like us, co-creators in divine acts of creation, acts in which we all can cooperate with our unique and distinct gifts. So just to wind down, because I don't want to go too long, I want to leave lots of time for discussion with Chris Haley and with all of you. What I argued in my piece on the Benedictine charism as poetry, I argued that we need to recover this language of poetic knowledge, grounded in its deep understanding of the human person as a unity of mind, body, and soul with a spiritual preconscience. And then think about education as forming the person in virtue to use their gifts for practical ends, for sure, but ultimately for practical ends with an understanding of a higher purpose. And so I think that specifically there are many ways in which I've seen this poetic knowledge being done. One certainly is in the realm of fiction and literature and storytelling. The word poetic knowledge immediately seems to lean towards that. So we absolutely need to recover, I think, a thick Christian Catholic culture of fiction and storytelling. We are storytelling human beings. Stories capture our imagination. Stories help reveal timeless truths about the human person. And stories are a form of organizing past, present, and future, right? Organizing how we think. So teaching great works of literature like the Divine Comedy, but also looking to great modern fiction writers. But lest beauty become synonymous with fine arts or humanities only, I also argue that, beauty is a driver of scientific innovation. Because again, beauty in the spiritual preconscious points to our creativity as human beings. And pushing back on this scientific rationalism, I argue that innovations in science are not primarily accomplishments of the experimental method, but they're accomplishments of human beings who have creativity and who can conceive something that does not yet exist in the world and then try to develop the tools to bring it into the world. So again, what's primary in scientific innovation isn't the experimental method. It's a human person who can conceive of an object that does not yet exist in the world and then test their idea using the scientific method and do that process iteratively in creating an object. And finally, and I'll make this my final point, although it may seem obvious, one of the ends of the liturgy in the Catholic Church is to open our hearts to a contemplative state of being. And I think perhaps given a lot of the modern tendency in liturgy, there's a lot of tendency to think of liturgy as active participation, which is wonderful to have, but we've almost lost the sense of liturgy as mystery, as participation in a mystery. I have another piece on this that I've put out, that I've written recently about the importance of liturgy as formation, as education. But I think in order for Catholics, at least in the United States, to recover liturgy as contemplation, we need to recover education in liturgy for people to properly understand what's happening in the different parts of the Mass and why we use all of our senses in the way that we do in Mass. So liturgy should be a form of aesthetic education, but liturgy that's not well done is not imaginative and cannot even hold our attention long enough to bring us to this state of contemplation and encounter with God. So I will just close by saying that what I hope you can remember, and I hope we can talk a little bit about more, is what does it mean to say education is about formation, and why in our current context is aesthetic education, education in beauty, so crucial. And for me, it's because so much of education has become, to use the words of Maritain, stony and technocratic and positivist. And we need to recover and reintegrate the contemplative and the practical sides of education. And finally, I hope you'll look more into Maritain's concept of poetic knowledge, because poetic knowledge starts from the contemplative, but it works itself out into the practical. And we need to think about the ways in which the imaginative is integrated into the practical and not separating them. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. Those beautiful reflections. And now we will turn to Christopher Haley.
Is it not by his high superfluousness we know our God? For to equal a need is natural, animal, mineral. But to fling rainbows over the rain and beauty above the moon, and secret rainbows on the domes of deep sea shells, and make the necessary embrace of breeding beautiful also as fire, not even the weeds to multiply without blossom, nor the birds without music. There's the great humanness at the heart of things, the extravagant kindness, the fountain humanity can understand, and would flow likewise if power and desire were perchmates. That is a poem, The Excess of God, by Robinson Jeffers, that Mark might have even expected me to open with. Is it not by his high superfluousness we know our God? For to equal a need is natural, animal, mineral. For decades now, we have been inundated with what's called STEM education to meet the needs of the economy, geopolitical, technological wars, and so forth. They've recently added an A for STEAM, but that's no better, and even perhaps worse, because this instrumentalization of art is based upon the recognition that orchestra students do well on SATs. But all this is still designed just to meet a need. It is still natural, animal, mineral, utilitarian. But Jeffers invites us to look at the great humanness at the heart of things. This great humanness goes beyond need. It is expressed, he writes, in extravagant kindness. Not just kindness, mind you, but extravagant kindness. It is anything but utilitarian. To fling rainbows over the rain and beauty over the moon and secret rainbows on the domes of deep sea shells. These are deeply human things and divine things. It reminds one of the ornate carvings in parts of cathedrals that no one will ever see, but the angels see, God sees. And humans did this extravagant thing because we can understand the fountain from which his high superfluousness flows. One thinks here of love, of grace, of self-sacrifice, indeed of the sacrifice on the cross. Karawatiwa's personalist norm states that a person is the kind of being to which the only appropriate response is love. Not use, not even justice. Love, extravagance, superfluousness. Beauty teaches us this. It shows us this superfluousness because it is this superfluousness. All of the most important things are, in this sense, superfluous. In Hildebrand's Beauty in the Light of the Redemption, he takes up the charge that beauty in this superfluousness is a mere luxury, that it is inessential, and even in some instances inappropriate. If you're Catholic, I'm sure someone has asked you at some point why the church doesn't just sell all its art and give the money to the poor. It's not an outrageous question, really, but it fails to appreciate, as Chesterton notes, that beauty precisely is a gift to the poor, and all of us in this respect are poor. Hildebrand gives a more extensive answer. He addresses those people who regard the beauty as a superfluous luxury, so noting that, excuse me, while not necessarily deleterious to the life of a Christian, it is certainly not essential. These people believe that Christians should rather focus on serious social and political problems, on utility. Hildebrand responds emphatically, this utilitarianism is by no means the spirit of the gospel. End point. Today we might say mic drop. He concedes that considering our unum necessarium, our one necessity, our salvation, that beauty is not, properly speaking, necessary, but neither, however, utility, politics, social issues. Beauty is certainly no less necessary than these. But to make the necessary embrace of breeding beautiful also as fire, Now that is extravagant, superfluous. But without that extravagance, we would be left with a brittle, desiccated understanding of the embrace of breeding. Without whether a materialist reduction or a certain ineffective understanding, such as in a particular philosophical habit of subordinating love to an act of the will, or reducing the purpose of marriage to procreation. I think Margarita's point referencing Maritain about a homo faber understanding would be applicable here. All of this misses the call, indeed the demand that beauty makes upon us. No doubt, we all know the famous last line of Rilke's poem, "You must change your life." And it is here that we find the reply to another common objection, which perhaps some of you are already anticipating. I might put it most simply and bluntly by saying, beauty doesn't work. It doesn't do the things we are saying it does. The project of aesthetic education has failed. It doesn't make people change their lives. It doesn't make them better. One need look no further than the infamous aesthetic refinements of the Nazis. But here we see most starkly the precisely wrong attitude toward art. It is what Hildebrand calls an egotistical and aestheticist attitude. It brings the beauty down to ourselves. Such people skim the cream, he says, of the beauty, but do not respond to its depths, to the world of values which it reveals. Such people enjoy beauty like a fine meal that melts in the mouth. They are concerned primarily with how it makes them feel. This is a real danger and not one to be easily dismissed. No one thinks him or herself to be an aesthete. Rarely does one set out intentionally and knowingly upon this path of aestheticism. Rarely, not never. There are those. But it can happen easily if we introduce utility and egoism into our attitude toward beauty. If we become too concerned with what it does instead of what we ought to do in response. You see this danger in contemporary art that is almost exclusively activistic and political, reducing art to a particularly forceful and creative way of making a point. But you also see it in perhaps less obvious distortions. Rocco mentioned yesterday that the liturgy is a kind of theater. In Liturgy and Personality, Hildebrand writes of how the proper disposition of reverence in liturgy forms one's personality. But as a secondary effect, the primary purpose is the worship of God. One can approach the liturgy, but one can approach the liturgy with a utilitarian attitude, asking it to do something, to meet my need, to give us a sense of community on the one hand, or uplifting music and art on the other. One can approach the liturgy with an aestheticist attitude, finding some performances to be too dull or crude, and seeking instead to find a satisfactory level of refinement in another performance of the liturgy. These are all egotistic aberrations and distortions. In John Paul II's letter to artists in 1999, we see the proper role of beauty. He writes, "May the beauty which you pass on to generations still come to be such that it will stir them to wonder. Faced with the sacredness of life and of the human person, and before the marvels of the universe, the rainbows on deep sea shells. Wonder is the only appropriate attitude. From this wonder, there can come that enthusiasm that raises us up. Beauty is a sursum corda. It lifts up the heart and shows us the way. The proper response to beauty is wonder, which, as we know, is the fountain from which philosophy, itself a type of love, flows." That's my point about everything important being superfluous. Do I have some more time, Mark, for a couple other points?
Or you can take 5 more minutes. 5
Oh,
more.
5 minutes. All right. So a few other things that didn't quite fit there that I thought were nonetheless relevant, especially to making talking about aesthetic education in persons. Excuse me. Hildebrand also talks in Liturgy and Personality about what he calls discretion, which pertains to the proper revealing and unfolding of values according to an inner rhythm, an objective logos. This applies also to our personality, to ourselves, that we also develop David Brooks's stories yesterday highlighted this sense of personal development and unfolding. This is an aspect of persons that art especially helps us to cultivate, both in our appreciation of art and also in making art. It's our, when you, so in the appreciation of art and beauty, it's never fixed, it's always deepening. Right? How many times have you read your favorite poem or listened to your favorite symphony? Maybe someone in the question should ask John Henry how many recordings he has of some of his favorite violin sonatas. Is it the same each time? No, not at all. The music develops, and so do we with the music. A similar development of personality is cultivated in making arts and crafts. Making a thing is distinctly different from operating a machine that makes a thing. Hildebrand, that's a long quote, but there's a great quote in Liturgy and Personality about this. But he says that we make shortcuts, right? Ultimately, and these shortcuts stop us from developing. When we instrumentalize, when we art, beauty, education, and when we, as Margarita talked about, when we fragment these things out, we take shortcuts just to reach ends as opposed to develop as persons. Another point I would like to make is on the objectivity of beauty. There are a few ways to talk about this, but the one in particular I think is most striking in the way that beauty has a way of cutting through relativity. Kant is right that aesthetic judgments are in principle universal. We might say that, oh, I like this and you like that, but we don't really mean it. Or at least if we do mean it, that it's not a matter of this thing I like and you don't like. If you don't like it, we think that there's something wrong with you, or there's something wrong with me, but there's probably something wrong with you. But that anyway, that objective claim helps us to break through relativism. And probably we've all had some experience where someone whose taste and judgment we trust finds something beautiful that we do not. This provides a wonderful check also against ourselves. At some point, you have to think that probably they're right. There must be something that I'm not getting. There must be more. For me personally, and I'm now at a place with myself where I'm comfortable of admitting this, I once did not like Mozart. And I didn't even really like Bach. I liked Brahms and Beethoven, of course. But I thought Mozart was trivial. But I had to hold out some reserve in my own judgment because everyone I knew and read loved Beethoven or loved Mozart. And I was sure that I was missing something. And then one day, the heavens broke open on the classical music radio station. And for the first time, I heard Mozart, and it was glorious. Mozart didn't change. I changed. Right? And this objectivity of Mozart had remained the same for me to discover. Last point. Beauty is communicative. This would require some metaphysics to really get into everything behind this point. So we're just going to skip to the conclusion. But I'm going to go ahead and assert that a work of art aims to manifest something essential, so the whatness of something. Right? I'm using language from Edith Stein here, the Wes and Was, or the Tien, as she would say, the pure form. And it's this core of meaning with which the receptive audience comes into relation, the meaning of the work of art. When the work of art represents the essence of an individual person, that person becomes known to the audience. In a very real sense, then we can say that Socrates lives in the work of Plato and that we can know Socrates in them. I think we all feel like this with some of our favorite works of art. We have a personal relationship. Thus, by preserving in existence a manifestation of the pure form of person, art allows for a sort of community between existing and non-existing persons. Moreover, if art can manifest the nature of a dead person to a living, it can certainly manifest the nature of living persons to one another. This implies that art can reveal to a person aspects of another person which were previously unknown. In this capacity, art can serve as a sort of translator between people, perhaps even across cultures, by revealing and appealing to common cores of meaning. A person's activities in the world are For Stein, realizations of his or her inner nature, but not full disclosures. What remains undisclosed in this person's life could be disclosed in a work of art. The same holds true for communities, who may be able to better understand other communities, past or contemporary, ally or enemy, through works of art. Communities thus can be formed, informed, discovered, augmented, and communicated by works of art. And to the degree that artists, works of art, and audiences participate in and become communities of beauty, the finite world becomes more true, disclosing more of the essences of things, right? And more beautiful, that is ultimately more godlike. And I will end on that note.
Thank you, Christopher, for those beautiful reflections. We're going to turn now to a couple of questions, and these questions have sort of grouped themselves very nicely into a number of categories. I want to start with maybe the most practical of these questions. Several people ask about how we can take these very important reflections you've all given on beauty and the place of beauty in education and apply them in very concrete ways. So several people ask how we can practically incorporate things like personalism and contemplation into education, especially secondary and higher education. And people are asking in very concrete terms, do you have any thoughts about how we can incorporate these insights about beauty and contemplation and wonder and so forth into the way we grade, or the way we assess our students, or the way we design our curriculum, especially given how all of these things are generally thought about in schools in very politicized terms or pragmatic terms, or often thought of entirely with a view to some sort of activism. How can we have a personalist and aesthetic teaching style in that light?
Well, this is something I've thought about because I can't say that I've ever taught at an institution that has given me instructions on how to do this. So I have been left to my own devices to apply this. Two examples on a concrete level of how I've done this. And all of my classes, I incorporate an experiential dimension that could either be going and doing an observation of something we're talking about in class, or doing an interview with somebody. And then I challenge students to relate their experience and something they've encountered in the world with the concepts and the theories that we talk about in class, right? So then the education isn't purely theoretical, but it's not purely experiential. And they like that. They like challenging what they see in the world with what's the toolkit they've been given. That, of course, applies well with the kinds of subjects I'm talking about. Now, of course, when it comes to grading, I have yet to persuade any institution that I have ever worked for that we don't need quantitative metrics on grading. I don't think that's going to change, but I simply add a qualitative assessment at the end of all my classes. And I have students reflect at the beginning of class what they're hoping to get out of it. And at the end of class, what did they like the most about the class? How did this class shape them as a person? How does it shape their vocation? And I take those essays and I edit them and I put them in my evaluations, or I put them on my blog with students' permission, because guess what? Administrators, in addition to numbers, they want stories. And if a student says that coming into your class made them a more creative scientist or a more imaginative, XYZ, and it helped them discern that they really want to apply for a fellowship in this, and guess what? Your student got the fellowship in that. So in addition to the quantitative assessments, which I as a sociologist have designed plenty of them, quantitative assessments give you average results across a large number of people. Narrative assessments give you the exceptional stories. And every school administrator I've ever talked to wants both. So give them the exceptional stories. Finally, I'll just say, and then I'll let Chris answer, part of my objective in my comments and in my book, The Love of Learning, is that knowing philosophy is practical. Why? Because you can't only know what you believe in. You have to know the philosophical ideas of alternative views of education, so that when your method of education seems to be working, you can explain the first principles behind it. So that's why I spend so much time in my book talking about John Dewey and Paulo Freire, because they have provided the lexicon for so much of education, and neither of them talk about the soul as we would understand it from a Christian perspective or the spiritual preconscience. And they have made education about transformation with no limitations. Hence we get, scientism run amok, we get activism run amok, because anything we can imagine we can do. They're not starting from a place of a concrete human being who is a unity of mind, body, and soul. And when you see that philosophical difference, it's practically very relevant, because it helps you understand the philosophical anthropological mistakes that are leading to the practical outcomes, which I critiqued. The rise in student depression and the kind of activism that's a little bit, that goes overboard.
Christopher, I didn't know if you wanted to.
I don't know if I really have anything to add to that, but Margarita has a lot more experience, this practical side. I would say almost perhaps more even from a student's perspective, right? Is that there's a great quote by William Morris, one of the founders of the arts and crafts movement, says that you have nothing in your home that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. Well, there's no reason this needs to be limited to one's home, right? I mean, this is, and I use that quote as opposed to some other kind of more high-flying thing that makes it seem like our schools should all be cathedrals. Like practically, we just can't do that, right? I mean, we don't have the budgets, and I know plenty of teachers who would just, they can't do these things, right? But that criteria, need or beauty, right? Just making things intentionally beautiful, giving people the opportunity. I don't really think that you can teach someone to love a great work of art, but I think you can make it accessible to them again and again and again and again, and give them that opportunity. And we should encourage that whenever and however possible. That's what I got.
Thank you both. So sticking with this sort of practical application of your remarks, a number of people in the question and answer have asked about how we can, in our own teaching, apply these reflections on personalism and beauty in such a way that we can deal with pushback from a number of quarters. And different people here in the question and answer have asked about pushback from really, I think, sort of three different groups. So first of all, there are those administrators, other professors, other teachers who are resistant to any talk about the spiritual nature of the person or the spiritual nature of beauty. Second, a couple of people have asked about how we can deal with a certain group of conservatives. One mentioned was Michael Akashot, who claim that the only purpose of the university, the only purpose of education is just having a conversation, that there's no ultimate telos, no ultimate good that we're aiming at. And they make this claim because they're worried about instrumentalizing education. So maybe worries congenial to some of the things that you all are talking about, but coming to a different conclusion. Finally, and maybe this is the largest group, at least in my experience, there are those who think education is just here to meet the needs of industry, that it's purely utilitarian. How can we bring personalism, bring beauty into our education and deal with pushback from that quarter as well? So how to deal with resistance, so to speak.
Well, I've encountered all of these questions in the talks I've given, and even in my own, experience as an educator and working with other faculty. So on the really, on the side of, education should be about creating skills for jobs that serve industry. I'm giving a talk on my book, The Love of Learning. I put the link in the chat box. I'm giving a talk on it tomorrow to students from Stanford University. And I'll just pose the question of whether or not we want all of our science and technology to be only produced in China, for example, right? What happens when scientific knowledge and technical knowledge is divorced from questions of the human good? How good has history been at showing us that science in and of itself knows how to ethically direct itself? I mean, it seems to me that it just seems obvious to me that we have to keep a both and approach here, right? Education needs to be about moral formation. And if it's not about moral formation, science doesn't have an end that's going to be for the good of the human person. And again, this isn't only a question for elite schools. I've talked to, people who run vocational schools who their degrees are going to be in hairdressing and driving a truck. These are all noble occupations. But since when did we think that someone who dresses hair or drives a truck doesn't have spiritual questions or doesn't have a moral character to be formed? And should we neglect their moral character because their vocation is a practical one? It just doesn't make sense to me. Now, the questions usually come back about the cost of education, and there's no time for this. And those are questions about why education costs what it does, and how did we get to this system, and why do students have to go into $100,000 of debt for an education that's not going to be a practical one? Those are all valid questions. But it doesn't make sense to me to simply throw out the moral. Why would we do that? The other practical questions, I'm sorry, if you could repeat them quickly though. So was that objection, the objection of?
There was an objection someone raised that they've encountered resistance from other conservatives who think that assigning any sort of telos to education above and beyond just sort of having an open-ended conversation is to instrumentalize it. So sort of radical anti-utilitarianism.
I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Oakeshott, with education being contemplative. But I guess I would just ask, does that mean humans don't have a practical end? Or is he saying universities or schools don't tell you what your practical end is? Or is he saying we just don't have one, that we're contemplatives in the Aristotelian sense, where we are just completely removed from the practical world, and the highest good for humans is purely to contemplate and not to act? Hence Maritain poetic knowledge. We're contemplative and we're practical, and in being practical, we're better contemplatives. That's what I would say.
Very helpful. Christopher, did you have?
Hi, just briefly, I think sometimes, and like Aristotle says, right, that a question well asked is half answered, right? Well, a question poorly asked is already wrong. And I think a lot of times these questions are just the wrong questions. And we do students and persons, including teachers, administrators, everyone, a disservice if we entertain sometimes these wrong questions without pushing back first, and saying, well, this, I challenge you to demonstrate that this is indeed the end of education. I think it's not, right? I'm not playing by those rules. I don't admit that. I think often defenses of beauty and liberal arts end up kind of seeding the field, and I don't think there's any need or reason to do that. We try to, show how that's as you mentioned about, people adding arts into education because it proves to be really good for test scores. Well, that's the worst reason to add arts to education, right? Like, you've lost that argument already, and maybe it does that, and I have no doubt that it does. But you're already kind of seeding that instrumentalization, and I know it sounds like an easy and perhaps idealist answer, but just don't do it. See what happens.
Sorry, now I remember the third objection. How do you communicate this to people who don't think the spiritual is important, who just aren't spiritual? Well, I would say that in secular or sort of non-explicitly spiritual environments of education, things like identity are really important, and things like emotions are really important. So there's all kinds of intangible things that may not be spiritual, but I think you can meet people where they're at. If they think student emotions is important, try to get them to see that, students also have perhaps a desire. Point to the clientelism maybe. Do students have spiritual questions? And it seems to me in the pluralistic environments that I'm in, students do have spiritual questions. So starting with a theological, doctrinal understanding of what the answers to the spiritual questions are is different than opening up the spiritual question as part of the human journey. And to open up the spiritual question as part of the human journey, you can refer to Greek philosophy, where our reason pointed to the transcendent, and we asked questions about ultimate truth and about immaterial reality. This is what philosophy used to do, not only Christian theology, right? So I think there's more resistance to doctrine and creedal religion than there is to having conversations about spirituality. So that's where the rubber hits the road in so many. Well, then I don't want spiritual to lead to the imposition of doctrine and creed. And so my question is, does a good religious education impose doctrine or creed. And I don't think Maritain would say that the end of religious education is to impose doctrine or creed. So I think people's usual hesitance is an imposition of a worldview, but we need to get them to see that the questioning of ultimate purpose is itself a spiritual quest.
Because we cannot bring in Wadiwa too much or too often. Worth referencing, I think, here is a point that religious truth needs to be proposed, not imposed. Right? And I mean, that's the personalist understanding that, because that recognizes and respects the dignity of a person, right? To accept these things and assent in their own conscience. It cannot. Should a religious, education, propose or impose? Well, it can't impose. It just can't even work, right? I mean, it totally. I mean, that would be a pulverization of the human person, even. So those are all things we need to get away from. And I think you're right, Margarita. Once you clear that ground, people aren't so worried, right? And because it turns out that what I was calling the superfluous things, those are the things that matter to people, right? You just kind of find the one that matters to them. And you mentioned, I thought a great example was the scientific method, right? That often throws people, right? And this, if you all haven't read it, I can't recommend highly enough one of my favorite books, Piercing's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where he makes this point, and he had moved from science into rhetoric because he realized that the whole point really of science was the hypothesis, and science didn't teach you how to come up with the hypothesis, right? And so he needed something else. So he moves from science to philosophy, ultimately to rhetoric, to try to communicate and have this metaphor, right, to come up with hypotheses. That's not a place no one's really suspicious of that book, right? You tell someone to, take a look at Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, they don't think that you're sneaking, Catholic doctrine in or something. So there's other ways sometimes that you can communicate these things.
Exactly. Thank you. I also just wanted to add, I know we're running out of time, but in nodding to my second session, just two quick things, if I may. One, anyone who's interested in the Love of Learning book, I put the URL there. I would love to see this book being read and discussed in reading groups. So please look at our website for ideas about how to do that, the possibility of even some funding for reading groups just to get you the books. But second, the question about how to make people even listen to these types of questions, I'll just nod to my next session, which is going to be on suffering. And I think that part of the reason I came to this more holistic understanding of the human person was because of experiences of loss in my life and death of people who I loved. And I think that the practical method of education that's not contemplative, that doesn't have the language of the soul, well, guess what? It doesn't work very well for the human person, because guess what? We are persons with souls. And sometimes people need a wake-up call. And so the people on this call today, I hope, are willing to stand in the gap and stay in the environment that God has put you in. And when people come to you with sincere seeking because something of the contemporary modern worldview that says you have no limitation, your body is nothing but a script, you can do anything you want, you can be anybody you want. When that message starts to ring hollow and untrue, people are going to open their hearts. And at that point, you can step in. And you don't have to impose doctrine. I don't believe in imposing doctrine anyway, as we just heard. You can invite people to experience beauty in nature or a painting and see what it sparks and accompany them. So I think we need educators who understand this quest and are in every kind of educational environment waiting for what looks like embers to become a spark and someone to turn back and to have a kind of metanoia and say, wait a minute, something's missing. What is it? And if you bring into your classroom or your church that spark inside of you, people are going to see it. They're going to feel it, even if they can't name it.
All right. Well, we unfortunately are out of time. We could probably continue this discussion for a long time. And I know there were many questions we did not get to, but thank you to both of you, Christopher and Margarita, for all these enormously fruitful reflections. And we'll take a quick break, 4 or 5 minutes, and resume with our second session of the afternoon.